Thanks for having me tonight. I appreciate it. Always happy to talk about this book and the people on this flight. Before I get started, let me also recognize a few people in the audience. First, we have Terry Shaffer, is the chief of the Shanksville Fire Department, the first responders on September 11th. Chief Shaffer. Also, two sisters who have a much more encyclopedic knowledge about my book even than I do. I'll try to say it right, Donna. Donna Glessner and Kathy Shaffer work at the memorial in Shanksville, and they have spent 10 years doing hundreds of interviews, gathering the oral histories of this flight, and they will be responsible for whatever, far beyond my book. They will be responsible for the greater knowledge of what we know about this flight. They're just done a terrific job. So on September 11th, I live in suburban Philadelphia, a little town called Havertown. I previously worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I've been at the New York Times for 18 years, but I previously worked at Philadelphia Inquirer, and so I just never moved to New York when I went to the Times. And I do a lot of traveling internationally and nationally, and so I'm not required to be in New York, so I stayed in Philadelphia. So I was upstairs at my house, and my wife, Debbie, who's here, said, "Hey, a plane just hit the World Trade Center. Turn on the television." So we turned on the Today Show, and while we were watching, the second plane hit the World Trade Center, and Debbie says, "Oh my God, what are they doing to us?" And so it was clear that it was a terrorist attack. So my first instinct was, well, you have to get to New York. They're going to need everybody they can get at the paper. But they quickly shut down the tunnels into New York, and it was impossible to get in, and it was even very difficult right away even to get phone calls in. So I finally reached my editors, and they said, "Stay in Philadelphia in case somebody tries to blow up the Liberty Bell or Independence Hall. We just don't know what's going on. Just stay in Philadelphia." So I did through the morning, and then nothing happened in Philadelphia. And then it became confirmed that there was talk there was another plane that crashed in western Pennsylvania. So then it was confirmed that Flight 93 had crashed. I'm not even sure at the time we knew the flight number. But so another reporter named Sarah Reimer, who also worked for the Times and lived in Philadelphia, she and I came out in separate cars, got here in late afternoon, and it was one of the most surreal journalistic experiences I've ever had. They set up literally a press conference in the middle of a cornfield. Governor Ridge showed up, and there's always a necessarily adversarial relationship between reporters and the state police and other authorities at that time, because we have different jobs, and their job is to set up the perimeter and try to find out what happened, and keep people away. And then our job, we're trying to find out, we're scrambling on deadline to find out what happened. But everybody seemed so stunned on this day that there was none of that sort of familiar antagonism. It was almost like, all right, we're all in this together. Let's try to get through this. So they actually everybody stood in line, the reporters. They put us on buses and took us up on a ridge above where that scrap metal plant was, right above the flight. So we saw essentially what you all saw that day of the smoking crater. And so I spent 3 or 4 days in Shanksville covering the flight, and then went home, went back, and I'm a sports writer, so I went back to my job being a sports writer and never considered writing a book. I had written one that had been published in 2001. It was the Women's World Cup soccer team, the famous tournament where the United States beat China, and Brandi Chastain took her jersey off. So my publisher at HarperCollins in New York, my editor, called me, who I had written the previous book for, and said, "Would you like to write a book about Flight 93?" And my first instinct was no, I don't, because I can tell you there's no worse assignment for a reporter than having to talk to grieving families. Because, first of all, why would anybody want to talk to a reporter at that time? You just don't want to barge in on people's lives like that. They're just, there's nothing you can say to them. There's nothing to console them. So why, I just was hesitant to do that. Second, because I'm a sports writer, I would be dealing for this flight with the FBI, with governmental agencies that I never dealt with. It would really take me out of what I was accustomed to, what I was comfortable with doing. And maybe my biggest concern was I was afraid of being overrun by history. What if I wrote the book and before it was published, a mountain of information came out about the book, and suppose I had it wrong, and then my book would be useless. But my wife, Debbie, said, somebody ought to write about these people. They were, somebody will. They behaved heroically, so why don't you do it? And she picked the title, and she's the reason that the book got written. So this was October, a month, 3 weeks after the crash and the hijacking. I started in October 2001, and my manuscript was due March of 2002. So that's 5 months. That's incredibly quick to have to. So I interviewed, I think, 300 people and wrote the book while still doing my sports writer job. So I still, to this day, I sort of wonder how it actually got done. But the aim, what I was charged with by my editor was, who were the people? Who were the people on this plane? So I think that's why people talked to me. As it turned out, people were willing to talk, and I think this because I told them I'm going to include biographies of everybody on the plane, not just the 4 or 5 people who had become well known in those weeks because they had made phone calls, and we presumed that they were making plans to take over the plane. But I wanted to get beyond that. I wanted to interview everybody. So I was fortunate. There were 37 passengers, 5 flight attendants, 2 pilots, and 4 hijackers. So I talked to all the families of the pilots, the flight attendants, and every passenger but one, the husband of one of the passengers, wouldn't talk to me and said, no, I think you're just profiteering on disaster, which it's a legitimate concern, and I'm shocked, frankly, that not everybody said that. And I tried to explain that, I was trying to provide the definitive account of what had happened on this flight. I thought it was a valuable document, but I couldn't convince him, which is, you're at that point, you're just gracious and you move on. Fortunately, I was able to talk to coworkers and other relatives of the passengers, so at least I was able to write a biography of this passenger too. So I wrote, it was like 5 months, I did it. And I've been a reporter for 35 years, so you always consider yourself, you're a hard-bitten reporter. You're not emotional when you're writing these books. I mean, the families were emotional, but I was. I mean, I was in such extreme deadline. You just do it. You just do your job. That's what you're trained to do. And then so the book was published, and I was fortunate enough to be on television programs and to give speeches, and that's what stunned me. I'm very good on the other side of the microphone, asking questions, but on this side, I'm terrified. And I was stunned by every time I speak about the book, I get emotional and I have to stop. So if that happens tonight, just bear with me. It just happens. They're often perceived as ordinary people caught in an extraordinary moment. But the truth is, these were very accomplished people who were at the top of their games in their daily lives, and knew how to put together a plan, knew how to carry it out. And so let me just tell you. The captain was Jason Dahl. His 5th anniversary was coming up 5 days later. He was going to take his wife Sandy to London on a trip. He changed at the last minute. There were 15 to 20 people who changed to this flight. Either decided to fly at the last minute or switch flights. A lot of people were sort of inadvertently on this one. So he switched his flight so he could go to London. The first officer was Leroy Homer Jr., who had grown up in Long Island and forced his parents to take him to the airport and we could watch planes land, even when he was 2 or 3 years old. The flight attendants, Lorraine Day had been a flight attendant for a long time and didn't care to work in first class anymore. The people were more demanding. She preferred to work in coach. She was a person that always knew everybody's birthday and holiday or anniversary. They called her the card lady. She was sending cards to Wanda Green had been a flight attendant in 1973, and she was looking to get out in a couple of years to be a full-time real estate agent. Matter of fact, she changed flights because she thought she was closing on a property in a couple of days, so she switched to Flight 93. C.C. Lyles, another flight attendant in Florida, had been a police officer earlier in her career and was married to a police officer. Deborah Welsh was the purser, so she would have been the flight attendant in charge that day. Lived in New York City, and sometimes she would take uneaten food from the plane and give it to homeless people as she walked home to her apartment from Port Authority terminal in New York. To her apartment, she would hand out food to the homeless. So for the passengers, Christian Adams was a German. He was the deputy director of the German Wine Association, headed to a wine tasting in San Francisco. This plane took off in Newark and was headed to San Francisco. Todd Beamer worked for Oracle Software. He's been a basketball and baseball player at Wheaton College in Illinois, and 2 young sons. And every time that the family, he and his wife Lisa, were getting ready to go somewhere, he would always round up the kids by saying, "Let's roll, come on, let's roll." Alan Bevan was a lawyer who lived in an ashram in New York State. A bright guy who didn't trust computers. He would put Post-it notes all over his computer instead of actually using them. Mark Bingham was a rugby player in California and barely made the flight. Showed up 15 minutes before the scheduled departure. His mother was a flight attendant for United, so he was flying out what's called a companion fare, and he got a seat in first class and just showed up literally at the last minute. Deora Bosley was a student heading to her junior year at Santa Clara University. Marion Britton was the assistant director of the Census Bureau in New York City. She was traveling to a conference with Lester Martinez, another computer expert who also the Census Bureau. Tom Burnett was a chief operating officer of a company that sold heart pumps. Had been a college football player. William Cashman was an iron worker earlier in his career. He'd helped build the World Trade Center. He was heading to on a hiking trip to Yosemite with a friend of his, Patrick Driscoll, who was also on the plane. Patricia Cushing and her sister-in-law, Jane Folger, were headed to California just on vacation. They were always afraid of earthquakes, so they stayed on the low floors of the hotels. Joe DeLuca was a software engineer for Pfizer. He and his girlfriend, Linda Gronlund, were heading out to Napa Valley that day. Edward Felt was a software engineer, a brilliant man who he had a couple of patents for encryption technology. And at one time at Cornell, he took a chemistry course just to help out a buddy. Colleen Fraser was vice chairman of the New Jersey Developmental Disabled Council, heading to a meeting in California. Andrew Garcia ran a company that distributed industrial products, a lot of them having to do with the airline industry. He had trained as an air traffic controller. Jeremy Glick had been a college judo champion. Kristen White Gould was a writer in New York City who was a descendant of one of the most influential people on the Mayflower. Lauren Grancolas was a marketing expert who had trained as an emergency medical technician, and she had was wanting to write a book about to help women in different areas of their life. And she had just gotten word that probably her book would be published, so she was getting ready to start writing it. And there was another. It was a very encouraging time for her. She had had a miscarriage once and had just found out that she was pregnant again, so she was hurrying home to see her husband. Donald Green, his mother, her last name was Sachs. She was a member of the family that founded Saks Fifth Avenue. His stepfather had worked for a company and had actually invented the air stalling device that's become mainstream on all planes. Richard Guadagno ran the Humboldt Wildlife Refuge in Eureka, California. And of all the people on the plane, he had had some anti-terrorist training, so he was equipped to do it. Toshiya Kuge was a Japanese student who happened to be a huge NFL fan, and he had a Steelers jersey with him on the trip. Hilda Marston was a retired woman who had been a teacher's aide in a school and was heading out to California to live with her daughter. Nicole Miller was a junior college student who had tried to get home the day before, she and her boyfriend, but there was bad weather on the East Coast the day before, so she got delayed and just decided to change her flight to Flight 93 on September 11th. Louis Nackey II was the head of a KB toy distributorship, and there had been some problem on the West Coast, so he had been out to dinner the night before. He got a call from his boss saying, "You've got to fly out to the West Coast," and he was going to fly out and come back on the same day. Donald Peterson and Jean Hoadley Peterson were the one married couple on the flight. They were both retired. They were born-again Christians who spent a lot of their time volunteering, and they had trained in crisis counseling. And at one point, Donald Peterson had run a company whose motors were used as the backup water pressure in the backup water pressure system on the World Trade Centers. Mark Rothenberg was a businessman who was sort of a liaison between. He flew to China and Taiwan 10 times a year, so he was sort of a liaison between people who made homeware in China and purchasers in the United States. Kristine Snyder was an environmentalist from Hawaii who was heading home from a meeting back to Hawaii. One of the more poignant stories on this flight, John Talagnani, who'd been a retired bartender in New York City, was heading out to California to retrieve the remains of his stepson who had just died in a car crash while on his honeymoon. Honor Elizabeth Wainio was she was the head of the Discovery Channel stores in sort of the New York area, including the big store in Grand Central Station. So these were all people really sort of on the top of the top of their games. So they start boarding the flight. The flight is due to take off at 8 o'clock. So all four of these hijacked planes were due to take off within 15 or 20, 25 minutes of each other. And there was a similar characteristic about all these planes. They were lightly loaded. Flight 93 had 44 people total on a plane that could hold almost 200 people. And it was headed across country, so it was full of fuel. And all these planes were the same way. They were hijacked because they were lightly traveled and they were full of fuel and could be turned into essentially guided missiles. So Newark, New Jersey, I don't know how many of you have flown out of there, but it just gets backed up. That whole New York corridor gets backed up every day. So United Flight 93 was due to take off at 8 o'clock. It didn't take off till 8:42. The first 45 minutes or so of the flight were just, as far as anybody can tell, were just completely, just a normal flight. And then all of a sudden, at 9:27, I think, the plane had almost reached Cleveland. So it was the Cleveland Air Traffic Control Center who hears Mayday, Mayday, and then it hears the pilot saying, "Get out of here, get out of here, get out of here." And the plane is at 35,000 feet. It drops 700 feet, and eventually at some point it goes up to 40,000 feet, and then it turns around and heads back east. And it remains one of the sort of the big unanswered question for me. Why did that plane go all the way to Cleveland? And we don't know. But it could have been the first opportunity that the hijacker, the first time that somebody opened the cockpit door, or there's some feeling that maybe the lead hijacker had second thoughts. We'll never know, but it's surprising kind of that it went all the way to Cleveland. So it turns around. It's presumed that both pilots were killed immediately, although we don't know that for sure. Many people presume that. And then we hear Jere Longman, the lead hijacker, say, "Keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb on board." And the passengers don't hear this. It's the Air Traffic Control Center in Cleveland hears this. And there's some thought that the pilots were, before they were killed or disabled, were able to sort of key the intercom system and realize so that the Air Traffic Control Center would be able to, the United pilots were able to do this so that the Air Traffic Control Center in Cleveland could hear what's going on. So even if they were killed right away, they seemed to be on the ball enough before that happened to key the intercom system so that people would find out that the plane had been hijacked. Debbie, so the lead hijacker was sitting in the first row. All four hijackers were seated in first class, and the other three planes had 5 hijackers, and this one had 4. And there were many theories at the beginning, even when I wrote my book, that we weren't quite sure. But now we know that the guy who was supposed to be the 5th hijacker had come into Orlando, Florida in August, and an alert customs official had become very suspicious and didn't allow him into the country. So that's why this flight ended up with 4. And one of the other things about this flight was that all the phone calls that were made, the 37 or so phone calls that were eventually made, reported only 3 hijackers. And what happened apparently was the lead hijacker was in seat 1B. He remained seated while the other 3 took over the plane. And so the passengers on the plane didn't notice him. So as far as I'm aware, nobody reported 4 hijackers during the flight. So the plane is now heading, towards Washington, and it does appear that the Capitol was the intended target. The other possible target, obviously, is the White House, but the White House is very difficult to see from the air. It's a small building, and the Washington Monument is right there. It would require kind of a slalom around the White House, and whereas the Capitol just sits up high, much more visible and inviting target. So that appears to be what the target was. So as I said earlier, I was trying to figure out who was this Jere Longman, this lead hijacker. Who was this guy? Why would he do this? 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. He was from Lebanon, and had gone to Christian schools, had lived a very secular life. It was a middle class or upper middle class family of bankers, civil servants, and his family was so stunned afterwards that they thought that someone had stolen his identification, that it couldn't possibly be him, although we now know in later years that they had expressed some concern. So he was born in 1985, which happened to be the year that the Lebanon fell apart into a long civil war. After high school, he moved to Germany, to a small town called Greifswald, Germany, where he, at a mosque called the Quds Mosque, he apparently encountered, radicalized Muslims who, in his own views, began to harden. But he also met a woman named Isel Singwin, who was a dental student, and so he appears to have had sort of mixed feelings about becoming radicalized to the point that he could hijack a plane and kill, fly it into a building. So in the mid-90s, he went to Germany and began to harden his feelings. He went to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the later 90s, and before coming to the States in 2000, I had met with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's the guy you always see on TV who was arrested, who had the T-shirt that's, where the neck of the T-shirt is down to here, and he's got the mustache and the sort of confused look on his face when he's just been arrested. He was the planner of this, and or the original planner. So he met with him there. His views began to become even more radicalized. Yet at the same time, he was dating this woman who, depends on who you believe, he actually married her in what would, I guess, be considered a civil ceremony, or they were still dating. But they would break up, come back together. He wanted her to wear a headscarf and wouldn't introduce her to his friends because he thought she was too westernized. So he finally came to Florida in 2000 and then took flight training in a couple places in Florida and took some self-defense courses. And I talked to people who knew him, and this one person said he's the kind of person you would bring home to meet your family, which is it's kind of a frightening thing. He did things like he broke a plate in an apartment and offered to pay for the plate, whereas most of the people who lived the transient sort of life in these apartments would break everything and offer to pay for nothing. So people who encountered him liked him. Yet, on the other hand, that's what he was taught to do. That's what Al-Qaeda had instructed these pilots to do, is to sort of blend in. Don't give people any reason to think you're the other or something. Just don't stand out. Just blend in. And he appears to have done that to a point where people thought he was the kind of person you bring home to your family. So at 9, his problem was that because the plane went so far west, the passengers started making phone calls, and most of them on the GTE airphones, which have actually strangely been removed now from most of the planes. But because the plane went so far west, when it turned around, the passengers began making phone calls, and they found out what had happened. They found out that planes had flown into the World Trade Center. So Jere and his 3 compatriots were not able to carry out their plan. So as I said, there were 37 phone calls made from, I think, 13 people. Just 11 passengers, 2 flight attendants, and they began to learn what happened. Tom Burnett called his wife Dina in California, and his first call, there's a record, I guess, his wife said he called 4 times. The record says 3, I think. His wife thought he was calling on a cell phone. Apparently it was on an airphone. But the first call, he said they have a gun on board, which really, for a long time, law enforcement authorities were interested in this because that's the only report that anybody had of a gun that day. But there has been no evidence found of a gun. Can we hear me now? Was it that bad before? No? Sorry about that. You should have raised your hand or something. I apologize. So Tom Burnett calls and tells his wife that they stabbed the guy, and everyone believes it was this passenger, Mark Rothenberg, who had been flying to China on a business trip. He was seated in seat 5B in front of one of the hijackers, and he's the only person in first class that didn't make a phone call later. So people presume that he was killed. Debbie Jacobs, who was the number one flight attendant, the purser on that flight, she also can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder pleading for her life, and it appears that she was killed or subdued right away. So the phone calls are made to other families. Tom Burnett keeps calling his wife Dina again, saying, we're making a plan. There's a group of us, and Dina, his wife, is trying to tell him, no, don't do anything, just sit there. And he goes, no, there's a group of us. We're going to do something. Jeremy Glick, the judo champion, calls his wife Liz in a call that lasts 24 minutes. I think the longest call. Tells her his first words are, "There's some very bad men on this plane." And he says they're wearing they've got red headbands on. One guy appears to have a bomb, something red strapped around his waist. What should we do? What are they going to do to us? I don't know. Liz, his wife, says, I don't know. And he keeps saying, well, are they going to fly us in, or are they going to? She tells him about the World Trade Center, and he says, are they going to fly us into that? And she says, no, because one has just fallen. So he makes a joke. Well, we have our butter knives from breakfast, and then he says, okay, we're going to make a plan. There are three guys as big as me. We're making a plan. Tom Burnett is called during his calls to keep saying we're going to have a vote. So it's clear that people are learning now what's going on from these other flights, and they realize they're going to die too unless they resist. Honor Elizabeth Wainio calls her stepmother in Baltimore. She's the woman who ran the Discovery Channel stores in New York. And she calls her mother and says, we've been hijacked. She calls her stepmother, and I think we're going to die. And then this poignant 4 or 5 minute phone call where her stepmother just says, okay, well, let's just talk. Let's just talk. And so she said, I've got my arms around you. She actually went out. I'm not sure if she went outside, but she I think she looked out the window, her stepmother, and said, I've got my arms around you. And Elizabeth said the same thing, I've got my arms around you. And she says, I'll soon be with my grandmothers, and who had passed away. And then they talked for a few minutes, and then she said, people are running up to the cockpit, I've got to go. And she hangs up. I heard 2 of the phone calls that were tape recorded. One from Lauren Grancolas, who had been emergency medical technician trained. And she called her husband Jack, who was still sleeping on the West Coast, and she just said, honey, I just want to call and tell you I love you. We're having a problem on the plane. But her voice was no more agitated than mine. And as Jack played the phone call for me later, her husband, he said it sounded like she was across the street ordering pizza. And I realized it was amazing how controlled she was at that point. I heard another call from Cece Lyles, one of the flight attendants who had been a police officer in her previous career. Her voice was a little more agitated and concerned. Her first call to her husband, Lorne, who was a police officer in Florida, went to voicemail. And then she called him back and said, baby, we've been hijacked. And they're talking for a few minutes, and she says, oh, they're rushing towards the cockpit, I've got to go. So we now know from these independent voices that we've got independent confirmation that this resistance is beginning. Sandy Bradshaw, whose husband was a flight attendant. Her husband was Phil is a U.S. Air pilot. So she called him and said that we were boiling water. We're boiling water to throw on the hijackers. And he sort of asked which direction. He's a pilot, so he asked which direction they're going. The sun, where's the sun? The sun's ahead of me, so we were heading east. And they were actually sort of in this area, probably between here and Pittsburgh at that point. So then she hangs up and saying, they're running to first class, I've got to go. Then the phone call that you all know about, Todd Beamer calls on his airphone and gets a woman named Lisa Jefferson near the Chicago airport. And he starts telling her, we've been hijacked. They say the Lord's Prayer. He says, will you call my wife for me? And then he pauses, and then Lisa can hear what appears to be a flight attendant saying to him that two people are on the floor in first class, and they're the pilot and the co-pilot. So presumably they were killed, although we don't know that. And then he's talking, and she can't hear, and then he comes back on and says, Lisa hears him just saying, okay, let's roll. So there's all this evidence from, I've just told you 4 or 5 or 6 phone calls where we know that there was resistance. Another passenger, Marion Britton, also called a friend and said there are 2 people laying in first class and their throats are slit. But we can't confirm. We just don't know because nobody survived exactly what happened. So at 9:57, from the time the plane was hijacked to the time it crashed, it was only 35 minutes. So at 9:57, the revolt begins. And on the voice recorder, I didn't hear it. I came close to hearing it. I didn't hear it, but passengers were allowed to hear it. They took notes for me, and I was able to confirm a lot of what their notes said. And then the 9/11 Commission report later confirmed it. So, one of the theories is that the passengers rushed forward using a food cart as kind of a battering ram. I don't know if you've been on a 757. I was on one Monday from Berlin back to Philadelphia, and I'm always struck on those planes that the 757 basically is a 737 stretched as far as you can get. It has one narrow aisle. It's not what you think of these big planes that have two aisles. It's one narrow aisle. So we'll never know exactly what happened. And the idea that everybody rushed forward at one time would be hard to do. I mean, I have difficulty just walking down that aisle without hitting both sides. But one of the theories is they use a food cart and maybe a fire extinguisher to rush forward. Then I'll read you a little bit from the transcript about the last few minutes. Before I get to that, one other thing I wanted to say was that this lead hijacker, Ziad Jarrah, had arguments with Mohammed Atta, who was the guy with the cold eyes who was hijacked the first plane that flew into the World Trade Center. But they had had arguments, and so one of the reasons people think the plane went all the way west to Cleveland was that some people think that Jarrah was really having second thoughts because, one, he had a girlfriend or wife, and he had been having arguments with Atta, and was maybe having second thoughts. But by this point, he didn't. I mean, clearly, he was flying the plane now. So the revolt begins at 9:57. At 9:58, Jarrah, the lead hijacker, tells another hijacker to block the door in the cockpit. And then he starts to roll the plane back and forth sharply. And then later he does the nose back because he's trying to keep people from coming forward. And a number of eyewitnesses actually saw this. A guy in a small plane saw it. Some people I interviewed the next day seconds before the crash saw. The wings were just waggling back and forth. He was just trying to keep people from getting forward. So he tells another hijacker to block the door. He rolls the wings. At 9:59, he begins to pitch the nose of the plane up and down. There's sounds of what appears to be breaking glass, plates, just a fierce struggle going on. At one point, Jere says, "Is that it? Shall we finish it off?" And another hijacker responds, "No, not yet. When they all come, we finish it off." There's fighting sounds outside the cockpit door. Unfortunately, a lot of this equipment was from the sort of 1970s vintage. So what they can hear in the cockpit voice recorder comes from microphones in the headset and in the cockpit ceiling. But it wasn't the technology on most of these planes was 20, 30 years old. So Jere says, "Is that it? Shall we finish it off?" Another hijacker says, "No, not yet. When they all come, we finish it off." So there's fighting. The nose of the plane goes up and down. At 10 o'clock, a passenger in the background yells, "In the cockpit. If we don't, we'll die." 16 seconds later, another passenger yells, "Roll it, roll it." Then at about 10:01, Jere stops his waggling the wings and pitching the nose up and down. He clearly realizes that it's over. So he yells, or he says, "Allahu Akbar," God is great, as he begins to pray. He asks another hijacker in the cockpit, "Is that it? Should we put it down?" And the other hijacker says, "Yes, put it in, pull it down." The passengers keep assaulting, trying to get into the cockpit. They keep coming forward. The hijacker says, "Pull it down, pull it down." And then at 10:03, according to the cockpit data recorder, Jere, who apparently was at the controls, turned the wheel to a hard right and drove the plane into the ground on purpose. When it crashed, it was going 580 miles an hour. It was upside down. So it hit this reclaimed coal mine in Shanksville like this, upside down. The cockpit broke off like the point of a pencil, not intact. It just shattered. The front wheel shot off. The axle went right through a tree. Part of the engine shot forward. .03, the plane is. So Rick King, who was then the assistant fire chief at the Shanksville Fire Department, gets a call from his sister in the minutes before the plane crashes. She says, "There's a plane flying over here. It's loud and it's low," and he thinks she's making it up. He doesn't understand. And then he hears it. So he runs out to his front porch and hears this booming crash and rushes out to the site. The other firemen are there. There's a big crater in the ground. The crater is smoking, but there's no plane. Nobody can find the plane. So Rick sends his firemen into the woods. It crashes into this field. There's a sort of a tree line of hemlock pines just beyond it. And when the plane crashed, there was a rock. There was a snake sunning on a rock. And when it saw the plane coming, it went into the strike position and essentially got fried there. And the snake still exists. It's apparently in an evidence locker or something somewhere. But I've seen pictures of it. I never saw the actual snake, but you could see it in the strike position. So these firemen keep running into the woods. They go, Rick, we can't find the plane. And then Rick realizes he's standing on the plane. He's on the crater. The plane is beneath him. So eventually, they find the cockpit voice recorder 25 feet underground. They find the data recorder 15 feet underground. The plane just went into the ground at 580 miles an hour. And so 10 years later, people want to know, one of the burning questions, was this plane shot down? And the answer is no, it was not shot down. You won't convince everybody, but that day there were only, at that point, nobody thought, the U.S. government did not think anybody would be, well, we now know that the president had received some, his daily reports that bin Laden determined to fly planes into buildings, but that wasn't a general feeling of the government. Nobody really thought that really would happen. There were only 14 Air National Guard planes on alert that day around the whole country. Nobody really thought that would ever happen to a plane inside the United States. Maybe a plane coming from outside, but not inside the United States. So there were only 14 planes available around the entire country. There were 3 pilots of F-16s who were scrambled from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And I interviewed them. They were sent 100 miles out into the Atlantic. The fog of war was so debilitating that day. These guys had no idea what they were doing. They weren't told, they didn't know anything. They finally came back and were sort of flying patrol over Washington. And one of the pilots told me that they escorted John Ashcroft's plane as he came back to Washington that day. But nobody in NORAD or no one who could have shot this plane down learned that it had been hijacked until after it crashed. The first time that they learned was 4 minutes after it crashed. So the idea in the 35 minutes from the time it was hijacked till it crashed that it was shot down is just not true. There was some debris found as much as 8 miles away. It was light papery material found in the direction of the prevailing wind. If you see photographs of that crater from above, you can see the indentations of both wings and the tail. So it's clear that, and there were, that area is a big hunting area. There were hunters who went through that area many times through the years, and no one's found sort of any evidence of parts of the plane breaking up before it crashed. I mean, you've all seen that one photograph over the barn where you see the smoke, which indicates that the plane seemed to crash intact. There's been a new video released in the last few weeks that seems to show the same thing. So I just don't think there's no evidence, that there's not any evidence that this plane was shot down. So I always, people ask, and I keep thinking through the years, well, what does this mean? What does this resistance mean? What did these people accomplish? In saving, likely, if that plane had hit the Capitol, hundreds of people likely would have died. So that the death toll would have gone up from 300 to 3,000 to 3,500 or whatever. It would have been an unspeakable tragedy. So sort of what does it mean? At first it meant to me that, that when you get on we sort of get on a plane and we sort of don't consider the others around us, that always look around, see who people are, that we can rise to the occasion. When we're called upon, we do it. We're not only Americans, but I think everybody, we rise to the occasion. But through the years, my thinking sort of has evolved a little bit that in many ways, I think that the hijackers were sort of far more successful than they actually believed they would be. Bin Laden admitted before he was killed that he didn't think the towers would fall. He wanted to attack the towers, but didn't think they would fall. But look what has happened to the United States since that. We fought 2 costly wars. We're at a point where we don't seem to trust our authorities. We're sort of divided. Democrat, Republican, red state, blue state, patriot, pinhead. We're a divided country. We seem to act on sort of narrow self-interest instead of a collective kind of good. And so for me, that's now what I sort of cherish most about what the people on this plane did. They had a half an hour to do this, and they made a plan. They carried it out. They did what they could do. Everybody, I think, on that plane did what they could do. And in my opinion, they're all heroes. So instead of acting in sort of narrow self-interest, they acted for the collective good. And I think they appeal to our better instincts. That if we all did that, I think we'd be in a better place now. So I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that anybody has. Feel free, and I'll answer if I can. If I know the answer, I'll answer any questions you have. Yes, sir.
At what time did the plane strike Tower 2 in New York? You know?
I think it was 9:03. So the first tower in New York? Second tower. I think it was 9:03. The first United Flight 93 took off at 8:42, and that Newark Airport is only 8 miles from Manhattan. So it flew, it sort of swung out towards New York, and the World Trade Center. At that point, that early, it was a beautiful day, if you recall. The storm had passed. It was a beautiful day. So in that early morning, the trade centers would often glow. They would get this sort of golden color. And 4 minutes after that, after United Flight 93 took off, the first plane hit the World Trade Center at 8:46. And so at 9:03, the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And I think at 9:37, the plane hit the Pentagon. And at 10:03, United Flight 93 crashed. Yeah.
Since the assassination of Obama, have we gotten any intelligence that would confirm or tell us more about where Flight 93 was actually headed, where they were taking it?
No, I think it's widely presumed that it's the Capitol, just because it's so visible. There would only be two targets: the White House or the Capitol. And the White House it's almost impossible to see from the air unless you really know where you're headed.
When you were conducting your interviews, did you do most of them by phone, or patient, personally, all of the above?
All the above. I started because 4 or 5 of these passengers had been well known. I figured I'd better start with their families because they had made phone calls. We knew at least that they had made phone calls. So I figured if they wouldn't talk to me, then it probably wouldn't be worth pursuing. But they all did, so I did that. The first person I talked to was Lisa Beamer, whose husband Todd Beamer is the one who said let's roll. And unfortunately for Lisa, there was a kind of a backlash against her by other families who thought that she was trying to gain the limelight and stuff. And I felt bad for this because that's completely untrue. She didn't, but she's since then I haven't seen her speak anywhere. I think she really felt the sting of that, and I haven't seen her publicly speak. So then I flew out to California, talked to Dina Burnett, whose husband Tom had called several times. Alice Hoagland, the mother of Mark Bingham, who was a rugby player, and then did a lot of it over the phone as well. I was just under such time pressure that they mostly ended up being over the phone because people were scattered all over the country. Yes, ma'am.
When you started the process, did you know that you were going to become some person involved? Your opposite fear.
Well, one of the reasons I almost didn't write the book was because I was a sports writer, and this would be sort of taking me out of my comfort zone. But in truth, being a sports writer really helped me because one thing about sports, the games are so familiar and repetitive. What you do is you learn how to write about people. So, and that's what this book was. It was writing about the people on the plane. So as a sports writer, you're trained to do that. So in many ways, the other thing you learn is you're taught, you learn as a sports writer how to write quickly. So in many ways, that really helped me. Yes, sir.
With all the interviews, is there anyone that's particularly well able yourself?
Hard to get a hold.
No, the person was very emotionally.
No, as I say, when I was doing the interviews, that wasn't the emotional part. I'm shocked tonight I didn't break down for 5 minutes. That's, to me, the hard part is talking about it. I have an acute stage fright, and I'm a reporter. I'm always where you are asking the questions. I'm not up here answering the questions. So that's the hardest thing for me by far is actually talking. It scares me to death.
Is
Yes, sir. No, no. Right. Yeah, so it would be 20, 21. Or he was a little older than that. Maybe he was born slightly before 85 or so, but he was in his 20s. I'm sorry if I... Yes, sir.
There was an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on 9/11 in which they interviewed a female pilot who had been scrambled, and she said that she was totally unarmed, that she was being asked if she was in fact told to do a takedown rather than a shoot down. I found that, I had not heard that last night.
Yeah, I think all of those 14 planes that were available around the country, I think you're right, not all of them were armed. So I think the protocol is you have to go up to these planes, identify them, try to contact people. I've seen no evidence that anybody knew about Flight 93 until it crashed, that anybody knew it had been hijacked. Plus, you know from all these ridges around here, the plane was flying so low, it would be very hard to find, much less shoot down or ram or whatever. Yes, ma'am.
Felt compelled to follow up and do another book concerning anything about Flight 93 or anything about the families possibly in the future?
That's a very good question. I did a story when I don't know how, the theatrical movie came out a few years ago, which is a very good movie, but probably hard for a lot of people to watch. I talked to some of the families then about the idea of heroism that movie was very democratic, just and sort of its opinion was mine, that everybody did what they could. I mean, you had Lauren Grant Coles was trained as an emergency medical technician. You had Jean Hoadley Peterson and her husband Donald were trained as crisis counselors. So my theory is that everybody did what they could, but there are some family members of passengers who believe that not everybody is a hero, that unless you made a phone call or devised a plan, you're not a hero. Alice Hoagland, the mother of Mark Bingham, is a leading proponent of that. But the problem with that kind of feeling is we don't know what happened. We know people made phone calls, but it's impossible to know who rushed the cockpit. And as I say, that aisle is so narrow, it's impossible for a lot of people to all sort of rush forward. But I think everybody did what they could. But so beyond that, the answer is no. I haven't thought about writing another book because I'm reluctant actually. I've kept in touch with the best friend of the pilot, Jason Dahl. But beyond that, I'm kind of reluctant to call people because I represent, even though I think most people like the book, I represent to them something that's, is tragic to them, and I know they want to try to move on with their lives, and I'm sort of reluctant as a journalist to sort of bring them back to that moment. I mean, I know from my own father's passing since then, and my mother, and talking to my mother, that there's no such thing as closure. That's a word. That's sort of a media concocted word to make us feel better instead of the families. So I'm reluctant to sort of to keep contacting them, but I do keep in touch with some of the sort of friends of the family. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that a gentleman got a call from his boss that he was to get on a flight and get out to California. Did you talk to that supervisor, boss, or whatever? I mean, I'm sitting here listening about people who switched flights or people who didn't make the flight or people who got on the plane, and my head's going thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if you could find anything out about,
No, I didn't talk to the supervisor, but it was one of these deals where there was the Kenny Nacky is the guy you were talking about, and Louis Nacky, and he ran a K&B toy distribution center in New Jersey, and there was some issue with a shipment of toys that he had to take care of. So it was, I think his boss wasn't an ogre or anything. I think there was just an emergency. He had to get out there quick. But yeah, I mean, the one person who was supposed to be on this flight was Robert Redford, and now I'm hearing today from my encyclopedic friends that I guess it was a flight he often took, but we don't know whether he was going to be on that flight, but apparently that was a flight he often took. Yes, sir. All right.
You've always been back to the site time since the events of time writing. What was it like for you to go back?
Well, I've been back, many times, and Wallace Miller, the Somerset County coroner, who, of all the people, I think he's the guy the families trusted more and thought that he had their best interest at heart. I mean, he's a great guy. Unfortunately for him, he's very articulate, so once the FBI saw that he could speak, they sort of let him go, and they moved away. So Wally had 10 years, he was the guy. I lost my train of thought. Oh, so Wally, in the months after the crash, Wally took me down into the actual area where the crater was, and it was stunning because there were bits of wiring and insulation and rivets just all over the ground. And I understand now that even 10 years later, stuff is still falling out of the trees. And I've been back, a number of times, but always to the temporary memorial. And today was the first time that I went to the permanent memorial. And I learned some things. It was very impressive that I think it's well integrated into the environment. It gives you a sense that you're still in rural Pennsylvania. I learned something new today, that the wall of remembrance with all the passengers and crew members' names is the actual flight path of the plane. I actually thought the flight path was slightly different, so I actually learned something today. But it's a powerful memorial. I urge you all to go there. I think it's well done. It's understated, and I think it's perfect for the environment that